We're in Ephesians chapter 6. If you guys want to open up your Bible and turn there. I have spent this week thinking about how do we change the world? And just a small topic, right? Like, how do we change the world? And I think there's some clues in Paul's household codes about how to actually change the world. Remember, we talked about household codes last week. We're having to do with marriage and how the marriage relationship is supposed to work. And then this week, we're going to go on to some other household codes having to do with children and parents and slaves and masters. And that last part is why I've been thinking through, like, how do we change the world? Because we already live in a world where we understand slavery is an evil that we don't want to be part of. And so Paul's commands to slavery has more to do with the description on how to live in a time where slavery might be the norm than a way of prescribing a way of life. He's talking about, if this is the norm, this is how you're going to live. But something he wrote changed the world. It changed how many people in Christian societies at least think about slavery, and something he wrote did that. So it made me consider, how do we change the world? When we look around and we see all these social evils, what is it that we can do that might be able to affect and change that? And I want to take you back just maybe to that first century church where Paul's words would have been heard maybe for the first time. You're in Ephesus and you all come together, and this is just odd in the first place because you have women there and you have children there, and you have slaves there with their masters. And that in itself is something that's revolutionary in that society, that there's neither Jew nor Gentile, slave or free, bond or freeman. Like we're all one in Christ, and you're all there together. That in itself was revolutionary at the time. Because in Rome, 1/3 of the population was slave class and living in slavery. So a lot of the interactions that Paul would have had with people who lived in slavery. Yet what he writes changes the way that we think about slavery today. It also changes what we think about women, because in Rome, women didn't have much of a thought or a say at all, and yet Paul says, husbands, love your wife as Christ loved the church. And just that one statement planted a seed of value in women of that time. And as that seed began to sprout and change, it brought us to where we are today, where women have this place that they would have never had in the past. Same thing is true with children. In the Roman world, fathers had the right to say whether who lives or dies. And if they didn't want their child that was born, they would just leave them out in fields. And you can read about how this happened. And there were actually people who wrote books about how to go out into the field where people had left their children and pick out the right kind of kid who would be most likely to grow up to be a good slave. Like, this is the culture that Paul is writing to. And yet, what he writes changes the culture completely, which has had me thinking all week, like, how do we change the world? Because we all see a world that's also evil in front of us, and we all want to fight against that evil. And the question is, how are we going to do it? And I've always wondered, why didn't Paul just write slaves revolt? Why didn't he just write, like, slavery is something that we should have no part of? And the reason he doesn't do that is because his goal is to share the gospel. And no one would have heard the gospel had he shared that kind of, like, fight against it message. He came about it at a different angle, showing that these people actually have value and planting seeds that would grow and show the value that they had. And so I just want to show an example of how Paul does this and why he does it. It's in 1 Timothy chapter 6. And he's writing to slaves, and this is what he says. It's verse 1. All who are under the yoke of slavery should consider their masters worthy of full respect, so that God's name and our teaching may not be slandered. So again, he's writing about a descriptive way about how people are supposed to live in order that the gospel can go out into the world without being slandered, right? Because here's the secret I want to get to before we get too far into this. The way that we change the world is by living according to the gospel. And if we just structure our lives in a way that reflects the gospel to the world, that is going to be what changes the world. And I know that it might be tempting to think that we got to go out and fight. But that's not the tactic that Paul takes. He shows us these household codes that describe the type of life that we're supposed to live. And as those early Christians began to live those lives, as they began to love their wives as Christ loved the church, the value of women changed in society. And as parents began to like not exasperate their children, but train them up in the ways of the Lord, all of a sudden we have societies that now have child labor laws, because value was placed in these verses, and as that value sprang up. Paul was living in a world where most of, at least 1/3 of the community was slave class, yet he says that God does not show favoritism. And those words have brought us to where we are today, where we understand slavery is an evil that we should have no part of. And so I just am pointing out that the way that Paul changed the world was by compelling you as Christians to live out the ethics of the gospel. And that same thing is going to be true as we continue in this text. The challenge is going to be for you to live out the ethics in the gospel. And when people see that salt of the world and the light, they will begin to change themselves. So we're in Ephesians chapter 6. And it's only 8 verses, so I'm going to read the whole thing, and you can see the ethics, the household codes that we're talking about today. Here's what it says. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with the promise, so that it may go well with you and you may enjoy long life on the earth. Fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instructions in the Lord. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear, with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win the favor when their eyes are on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly, as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward one for whatever good they do, and whether they are slave or free. And masters, treat slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. And so there's 2 more household codes. How are parents supposed to interact with their children, and how are masters supposed to interact with their slaves? And my point is, as we go into this, is just understanding that Paul changed the world just by compelling Christians to treat wives with love, children as if they have meaning and value, and reminding slave masters that God doesn't show favoritism. And just those seeds that he plants changes the world. It compels us to structure our lives in the way that people might see that and glorify our Father in heaven. If we want to change the social evils that we see in our world, live like the gospel tells us to live. That's going to be the idea. And so my first point is that we should structure our family in a way that reflects the gospel. We should structure our family in a way that reflects the gospel. And this started out last week with the command for wives to submit to your husbands, and husbands to love your wife as Christ loved the church, because that one statement brought value to women. It was a seed that Paul planted that grew up to give them the place that they have today. But now when we're looking at how parents are supposed to parents are supposed to treat their children, and how children are supposed to treat their parents, there are more seeds being planted that is going to give value to children in a world where they had none. Like, just think for a second of the fact that Paul writes, children, obey your parents. That in itself implies that there were children in the room, that they were part of what was going on, and that Paul thought enough about them to include them in the letter. That didn't happen in a Roman society. That happened within a Christian society. These are Christian household codes, where children are not treated like property anymore, but are treated like they matter. They're part of the conversation. I remember we had a time where we were discussing whether or not we should allow children to be part of the services, and should we allow them to take communion, to not take communion? Should we leave it up to the parents? And this is the verse that I went to. Like, children were included in that first community. They were seen as valuable. They weren't pushed into the other room to be done away with. They were part of it. And just look at how he says it. He says, children, obey your parents in the Lord. And again, that's both like the limiting factor. Parents can't ask kids to do things that would go against their faith, but it's also the motivation for it, right? Like, my kids need to hear me in this, and I have two of them here, so excuse me if I'm just talking to them instead of all of you tonight. Children, obey your parents in the Lord because this is right. That's what he says. So why are kids supposed to respect and obey their parents? Just because it's right. I know as a parent that I am an unreasonable person sometimes. I know as a parent that sometimes my commands are like, they're just not well thought out. Usually my commands to my children have more to do with the fact that I'm feeling lazy tonight. Like, this was great when my kids got their driver's license, my one son, because now I could be like, hey, go to the store. How about Dairy Queen, right? And you can hear him grumble when I say, Michael, like, what do you think? Should you go to the store and get us something to drink today? And you can hear him like, right? Paul's saying that he should do it, but why? Because it's right. Not because I deserve it, but just because it's right, he should do it. And that's what Paul is going. And here's the thing. This ethic, this idea of children obeying your parents has to do with the fact that when they treat their parent like they honor them and are obedient to them, they are reflecting the gospel. It's not because I deserve it. It's because my kids hopefully care enough about the gospel that they want to reflect it in how they treat their parents. He'll go on to say, look at what he goes on to say. Listen to this, Michael. He says, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Verse 2, honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with the promise, so that it may go well with you and that you might enjoy long life on the earth. So you get this promise too in it. If you honor your parents, you're going to enjoy long life on the earth. And he says this is the first commandment with the promise. And I guess if you discount the first commandment that says no gods before me, no idols, and if you have idols, then I'm going to punish for generations, and if you don't, then I'm going to forgive for generations. If you take that and say that's not a promise, then yes, this is the first command that actually comes with the promise. It'll go well with you. But I really think what he's talking about, this is the first command that kids hear. Right? Hopefully this is the first command that you remember as a kid. Like, shut up and listen to your dad. Right? That's usually what it sounded like, is listen to your parents. Children, obey your parents. Listen to them. And as your parents began to teach you, like they were investing in you. That's the biblical idea, is your parents were teaching you, it's raising you, and it's going to go well with you, this long life. Honor your father and mother. And I was thinking about this more and more because I don't think the command to honor our father and mother is specific just to the young kids. In fact, as I am a member of First Christian Church, what I find out is often I see children, honoring their parents far into their adult life. I see Ken taking care of his dad. I see Sandy taking care of her mom. And you know what? Their life, the way that they do that, is reflecting the gospel to everyone around them. Because it's not easy. Can I get an amen back there, Kathy? It's not easy to take care of your parents. But why do you do it? Because it's right. That's what he's getting at. See, we might be going back to a time where many people who are aging are just thought of as less and just pushed off. And not thought of anymore. Kind of like what was happening in Rome, right? At certain points, people just don't matter anymore. They don't count. Yet what Paul is saying here is that children, you honor your father and mother because this is right. It's not easy. Sometimes your parents are unreasonable. Sometimes they make you go places you don't want to go. Sometimes they're old and cranky, but you have to honor your parents because this is right. And it comes with a promise. It's too many pointing fingers out there when I said old and cranky. Here's what he goes on to say, though. He says, fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in training and instruction in the Lord. I find in that like a mission state for me as a father. My job is to bring up my children in the way of the Lord. I can't do that when I exasperate them. That just means to make angry. So, although, going back to my example with Michael, although I know that I could probably ask him to go to the store for me, and the right thing for him to do is just to say, yes, Dad, I also know that I have to be considerate of the fact that maybe he's had a long day at work. And maybe, I'm just being like, I have to care enough about him that I don't want to make him angry, because in making him angry, I'm just making his life harder. And that's not my job as a parent, right? It's not my job as a parent to make my child angry or exasperated. God cares about their mental health. Like, if you look at how this is stated in Colossians chapter 3, verse 21, it's the same command, but this time it comes with an explanation, kind of. He says, fathers, do not embitter your children, or they will become discouraged. How often have you seen parents who are so hard on their children that they actually have mental health issues? They actually become discouraged and depressed and feeling like they can't be enough or do enough. That's not your job as a parent. And I know that I'm talking to a lot of grandparents, but there's some parents in here that are learning how to raise their kid. And if you are a parent that is so heavy-handed on your kid that it affects them, you're not helping them. You're not bringing them up in the Lord, right? So I have to remember too, even with my commands, that I have to treat my kids in a way that is pushing them more towards Christ. And if I present myself as somebody who is just angry and just unwilling to bend, I'm not showing Jesus to my kids. And my job as a parent is to show Jesus to my kids. Sometimes I do a really good job of that, and then there are a lot of times that I don't. And then I hope grace takes over at that point. But the point I want to make in this first section is we consider just this first household code of children taking care of their parents. It's a reminder that the way that you raise your children will change and shape them. It's a way that you could structure your life that will reflect the gospel to your children. And that's what I want to do. I want to bring up my kids in the way that they should go so that when they're old, they won't leave it, right? That's my goal. So in these verses, we have planted something the Roman world didn't understand. And that's that kids have value, and it matters how you talk to them. Now, Paul could have just wanted to fight for children's rights, but instead he planted a seed that said they matter. And that ethic has grown and grown and grown to the point that we are today in our society, where we have child labor laws. And so Paul shaped the world by compelling people to live out the ethics of the gospel. My second point is that we have to structure our relationships in a way that reflects the gospel. And he's going to be talking specifically to slaves, but we have to remember, this isn't a norm for us. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about slavery back then, but also I'm going to compel you to remember that maybe the way that these relationships work in our own life have to do with how you function at work, or what type of employer or employee you are, or maybe how you treat that person that's serving you in the restaurant. That's the kind of implications that it might have for us today. But I do want to talk about slavery a little bit because Paul talks about slavery. And if you look at verse 5, he says, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear. And this is just the first seed of hope, because these are just earthly masters, right? And you've been redeemed, and you're longing for your redemption. So you're already, but not yet there. And you just have to deal with this for a little bit longer. They're earthly masters. And you have to treat them with respect and fear, right? Slavery during Paul's time, there was no part in the known world. Actually, there's two parts. One that might be of interest. The Essenes did not accept slavery. They were one desert tribe, a desert Hebrew tribe, that once we found the Dead Sea Scrolls, we found that they did not accept it. Maybe it's because they had been so closely linked to the exile that it's a part of their life that they got rid of completely. So the Essenes did not accept slavery. Other than that, there was another tribe in Egypt somewhere that also didn't accept slavery. But the rest of the world, this is just the way that it was, right? It was like drinking water from a water fountain. 2 years ago, that was normal. Now you just can't do it, right? And 2 years ago, you just wouldn't have thought about it. Like, everybody does this. Now you know, hey, I would rather have one of those ones I put my cup in and it fills it up, right? The world changes. That's all I'm trying to say. And if you're thinking about slavery as the Bible puts it out there, the Bible had this idea of bondservants, and it was people who offered themselves freely instead of was forcefully taken, right? So if you were working for somebody, you could pledge your life to them, and you would become their servant. But it was something you gave yourself over, and they promised to take care of you. That's a biblical idea of servanthood or slavery. It's called bondservant, but sometimes the word can be translated as the slave. But the Bible, the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, gave a precedent for slavery that said people have value. You can't treat them like they're animals, right? The Roman world didn't have that. And Paul's writing to the Roman world. The Roman world had a form of slavery that the only main distinction between the slavery in the Roman world and the slavery that we had in our recent past is that the Roman form of slavery was not ethnically driven. So it wasn't because you were a certain race. In fact, you could be a slave in Rome no matter what race you were. I mean, heck, they would throw their children out into the fields, and so you might actually, by getting a slave, you might actually get a child of somebody who was distinguished in their society. So it wasn't a matter of ethnicity that led to slavery, but the slavery was just as real and just as harsh with some people, because slaves were not thought to have any value. And yet Paul tells us that we have to obey them because they're just our earthly masters, right? This is the world. He's describing the world that they live in, and he's not saying that it's fair. He's just saying the way that you change this is by living out the gospel. That's how you change it, is you live out the gospel. And so he says that. He says, slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Now, I want you to picture maybe you're a slave living in this world, and you're thinking you're working for a slave master who might not be a Christian. How do you like come to grips with serving him? How do you become okay with that? Well, you accept that what you're doing for him, you're actually doing for Christ. Maybe you are a slave who has a Christian master, and that's got to be hard too, because how can this brother treat me as if I don't have value? Well, the answer will be work for him or her as you would work for Christ. Because in doing that, you are reflecting the gospel, right? And Paul has a play on words. He uses the same word for master as he does for Lord. The NIV will change it so that we don't get confused. But his point is that we have to both remember that both slave and master has one Lord, right? So this is how he says it. Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity in heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eyes are on you, but as slaves to Christ in doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each of you, or each one, for whatever good they do, whether it is slave or free. The point is that we have one master. That's why he uses the same word for your earthly master and your heavenly master. And the way that you interact with your earthly master reflects what you believe about your heavenly master. And so he's saying be submissive. He's saying be obedient. Today we would say something different, like run away. Don't be subject to that. But I want you to recognize the reason that we would say that differently today is because Paul planted in here human value in a world that had none. He said God does not show favoritism. And that seed has sprouted to a world that at least in areas that are shaped by the Christian ethic, we now understand slavery is a social evil we want nothing to do with. Why? Because Paul showed us that they have value, that God doesn't show favoritism. And as that thought began to grow, we began to shed that sin that used to entangle us, right? So this is an idea, like we have to remember as we're going through this, that we, in our relationships with Christ, are the slaves, right? This is what Jesus talks about in Matthew chapter 20, verses, I'm going to start in verse 24, but I'm going to read on. It says, when the 10 heard about this, they were indignant with the two brothers. See, they asked, who gets to sit on your left and right? They wanted to know who gets to have authority. And then verse 25, Jesus called them together and said, you know that that rulers of the Gentiles lord over them, and that high officials exercise authority over them, but not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to be great among you must become the servant, and whoever wants to be first must be the slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom. Here's what I'm trying to say. Jesus made himself a servant, a slave. And in this relationship that we're looking at, we're the servants of Christ, right? We're the ones who have to be submissive and obedient and serve wholeheartedly our Father who's in heaven. And so the description in this relationship is a description of how we live today in relation to God. He's not a master that is hard or burdensome. In fact, he says his yoke is easy and light. He's the kind of master that we want to follow because he cares, right? But it still describes the relationship that we have with our Heavenly Father, right? As Paul goes on in Ephesians chapter 6, he ends it by saying this, and masters, treat your slaves in the same way. I stopped there because what does the same way mean? Are masters supposed to be obedient to their slaves? Is that what he's saying? Is he saying that masters are supposed to treat their slaves wholeheartedly and care about them? Is that what's all going into this in the same way? Is he saying in the same way that just as the Lord will reward the slave for whatever good he has done, maybe he's saying in the same way, the Lord will reward the master. But that word reward also carries an idea of judgment, right? Because if you're harsh to your slaves, then maybe you could change that word reward to punish, right? Because God cares about how they would treat people. And he could have just fought and said, revolt against your masters, but that wouldn't share the gospel. Instead, he said, live out the implications of the gospel. Husbands, love your wives. Children, obey your parents. Fathers, bring up your children. Slaves, obey your masters. And masters, do the same. Do not threaten them, since you know that he is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. See that last part, that there's no favoritism with him? That's the nail that put an end to slavery in Western cultures. The idea that God cares about each person equally changed how we viewed people, changed how we think about slaves. And so today we would say something completely different. My third point is that we should conduct ourselves in a way that reflects the gospel, because I really think this is, like, as we look back on all the household codes, there were 3 of them. How a husband's supposed to treat the wife and the wife is supposed to treat the husband. How a child is supposed to treat their parent and how a parent is supposed to treat their child. And how a slave is supposed to treat their master and how a master is supposed to treat their slave. And all of it had one common theme running through it. You do it as to the Lord, right? And so that was the common theme that ran through it, that shaped and changed how we view women, how we view children, how we view slaves. But I wonder what social evils we want to change today. What things that we look in our society and say that is an evil that needs to be done away with. But my question is, do you change that social evil by fighting or by living your life in a way that reflects the gospel? And I think the answer should be obvious to us. Paul doesn't say revolt. He says live as to the Lord. And that's the command for us today. I don't know what the social evil is you have in mind, but if you live as to the Lord, it's going to shape. And that's my encouragement. We're going to